James Sullivan had envisioned a peaceful life when he moved to the Ridgewood Estates, a pristine, gated community known for its manicured lawns and so-called high standards. It was supposed to be his sanctuary, a place where he and Maxie Sum, his loyal golden retriever and certified service dog, could live quietly. After years of service overseas, James was looking forward to some tranquility. But Veronica Blake, the self-appointed enforcer of the Ridgewood Homeowners Association, HOA, had other ideas. It started subtly, a pink violation notice slapped onto his front door within a week of moving in. Unauthorized pet violation. It read in bold letters, as if Max was some stray mutt rather than a fully trained service animal protected under federal law. James barely had time to process it before he heard an unmistakable voice from behind. "You must be the new neighbor breaking our rules," Veronica sneered, her arms crossed as she marched across his lawn. With her tailored blazer and the superiority of someone used to getting her way, she was every bit the HOA dictator he'd heard horror stories about. James remained calm, his congressional training kicking in. "Nice to meet you. I'm James, and this is Max, my service dog." Veronica's lips curled. "We don't allow large dogs here. They lower property values." James tightened his grip on Max's leash, sensing trouble. He had faced ruthless politicians in war zones, but something about Veronica's smug expression told him this battle was only just beginning. James took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm as Veronica Blake, the self-righteous head of the Ridgewood HOA, stared him down. She exuded an air of control, the kind of person who thrived on rules and expected absolute obedience. Max, his golden retriever and service dog, sat patiently beside him, sensing the tension. "You don't look disabled," Veronica said bluntly, her gaze scrutinizing James like he was a problem to be solved. James clenched his jaw. He had spent years in Congress, fighting for the rights of veterans and disabled individuals, but this was personal. "Not all wounds are visible," he replied evenly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out Max's official service dog certification. "And under federal law, Max is protected." But Veronica just smirked, pulling out her phone and snapping photos of his house, his garden, and Max. "We'll see about that," she muttered before storming off. That night, James found himself unable to sleep. Years of military service had trained him to recognize threats before they fully materialized, and his instincts told him that this was just the beginning. Max stayed close, his presence grounding James as he sifted through the HOA regulations, looking for anything that might justify their actions. There was nothing, no clause, no rule, no policy that gave them the right to harass him over Max. Then, the next morning, he woke up to find a fresh coat of spray paint on his garden fence. Violation, written in blood-red letters. Max's paw prints trailed through the paint, making it clear what their intent had been. James's stomach twisted with anger as he checked his security camera footage. There she was, Veronica Blake, standing at a distance, directing a young HOA worker to deface his property. Before he could react, there was a sharp knock at the door. Standing outside, clutching a folder thick with complaints, was none other than Barbara Thompson, the HOA president, with Veronica lurking just behind her, filming everything. James folded his arms. "Morning, ladies." Barbara didn't bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Sullivan, Ridgewood prides itself on maintaining a certain standard. Many of your neighbors feel that perhaps this isn't the best place for someone like you." James caught Veronica smirking, her phone still raised as if waiting for him to explode on camera. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Smiling, he took the folder, flipping through the absurd complaints. Max's fur color clashing with the aesthetic of the neighborhood, the sound of his breathing being a disturbance. His presence, scaring children. Then James looked straight at Barbara and said, "By the way, does the HOA carry insurance for violating federal housing laws?" For a split second, Barbara's polished smile faltered. From behind her, Veronica's camera stopped recording. They had just picked a fight they couldn't win. If you think James should fight back, comment number justice for Max below. If you're on Team HOA, but we doubt it, hit like. And don't forget to subscribe for the next shocking twist. You won't believe what happens next. James woke up the next morning to the sound of a camera clicking outside his window. He groggily rubbed his eyes before glancing at the clock. 6:30 a.m. His body tensed. Veronica Blake was standing on his lawn, her designer yoga pants and pink jogging jacket almost glowing under the morning sun. Max, always alert, let out a low growl, his golden fur bristling. "Gotta document all the dog poop ruining our property values," Veronica shouted when she noticed James staring at her through the window. James clenched his jaw. Max was trained to be meticulous, and James had installed a self-cleaning waste disposal unit in his backyard. There was no way she had actually found anything. Later that morning, James discovered printed flyers stuffed into every neighbor's mailbox, all about a dangerous animal in the community. A grainy, poorly edited photo of Max sleeping in his yard was printed on the front, his mouth slightly open in a yawn. But in the picture, his teeth were circled in red, labeled as aggressive fangs. James kept one as evidence. This was no longer just harassment. This was defamation. And then, things got worse. That evening, James took Max for his usual walk around the neighborhood. They strolled past the community garden, where James had volunteered months ago to plant fresh produce for struggling families. He caught sight of Veronica whispering furiously with Barbara Thompson, the HOA president. "That dog spreads disease," Veronica hissed, waving her arms dramatically. "And those tomato plants of his? They're not regulation height." James paused mid-step, pulling out his phone. With a few taps, he played the recording from the last HOA meeting, where they had personally approved his garden plans. Veronica's face went through 50 shades of purple. "You're not allowed to record HOA meetings," she screeched. James kept his voice calm and steady. "Actually, I checked. I am." Veronica's lips curled in frustration, her anger bubbling just beneath the surface. But James wasn't done. That night, while making dinner, James smelled something off. A chemical stench wafted in through the window, sharp and acrid. Max suddenly sprang to his feet, barking frantically. James rushed outside and his stomach dropped. His entire garden was wilting. The vines sagged, the leaves browned at the edges, and the tomato plants he'd been growing for months collapsed onto themselves. Someone had doused them in industrial-strength weed killer. James ran to check his security cameras. There, caught in 4K, Mike Blake, Veronica's husband, in a black hoodie, sneaking onto James's property with a spray bottle. James gritted his teeth, his hands shaking with fury. Enough was enough. He picked up his phone and dialed. "Officer Reynolds? I'd like to report a crime." James barely got any sleep that night. The evidence was damning, but he knew how these HOA power players operated. They would fight tooth and nail to cover their tracks. By morning, a new flyer had made its way into everyone's mailboxes. This time, it wasn't just about Max. James himself was the target. The headline read, "Unstable veteran causing disturbance. HOA taking action." Below, a photo of James, taken without his knowledge, showed him standing in his front yard, Max by his side. The caption twisted reality, painting him as a dangerous, unpredictable presence in the neighborhood. James clenched his fists. They were trying to paint him as a threat. He walked outside, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. Just then, a rock hit his mailbox with a loud thud. His head snapped toward the source. Tommy Blake, Veronica's teenage son. The boy stood frozen, his face pale, his hand still gripping another rock. But his mother, Veronica, was right behind him, forcing his hand. "Go on, Tommy," she barked. "Teach him a lesson." The kid hesitated. His lips trembled, his eyes darting toward the ground. James took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "Tommy, this isn't you." Before the boy could react, Veronica yanked him back, shaking with rage. "I won't have a war veteran destroying my community," she screamed, voice shrill. James's stomach tightened. She was escalating. And that's when he saw it. At the end of the street, neighbors were watching, some whispering, others pulling out their phones. Some looked guilty, others looked nervous. They knew this had gone too far. James turned toward his house, his security cameras capturing everything. This time, Veronica had played right into his hands. But just as he reached his door, a loud bang shattered the air. James froze. Max yelped in terror, bolting toward him. Heart pounding, James turned. Smoke curled in the air, coming from Veronica's backyard. And then, screaming. James raced toward the fence, Max beside him. Veronica's garden shed was on fire. Flames licked at the wooden panels, the heat radiating in waves. Veronica stumbled backward, clutching her phone. My house! My house! Her face twisted in horror. She spun toward James. You did this, she shrieked. You set my house on fire for revenge. Neighbors gasped, stepping back. James's blood ran cold. She was trying to frame him. But then, a new voice rang out. No, Mum, stop lying. Tommy. The boy's voice shook, but he stood firm. You poured the gas. The street fell into silence. James exhaled slowly. The tide was turning. James stood frozen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The fire crackled behind Veronica, the flames casting a sinister glow over her twisted expression. Tommy had just exposed her. The boy shrank under her glare, but he didn't take his words back. He had finally broken free from her control. You little traitor, Veronica hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Do you realize what you've just done? The neighbors held their breath, watching as the truth unfolded in real time. A second later, a loud siren tore through the tension. The fire department and police arrived, red and blue lights flashing against the burning wreckage. Veronica spun on her heels, eyes wild, searching for a way out. But there wasn't one. A firefighter rushed past James and Tommy, his radio crackling. We've got a suspicious ignition point here. Smells like gasoline. Another officer stepped forward, his gaze landing on Veronica. Ma'am, we're going to need you to step aside. But Veronica wasn't done yet. She whipped around to face James, her eyes filled with venom. This is your fault, she screamed. You and that damn dog, you ruined my life. James took a slow step forward, meeting her rage with steady, unwavering silence. Max stood by his side, ears perked, his stance protective. No, Veronica, you did this to yourself. For the first time, something cracked in her face. A flicker of realization. She had lost. The officers weren't listening to her anymore. They were questioning the neighbors. And then, one of them approached Tommy. Son, he said gently, can you tell us what happened? Tommy's lips quivered, but he nodded. His voice was quiet but firm. I saw my mum with the gas can. She was yelling about how James needed to leave. She poured it around the shed and lit the match. Veronica's face drained of color. The weight of his words sealed her fate. One officer lifted his radio. We need an arson investigator on site. Possible criminal charges pending. Veronica let out a choked gasp. You can't do this to me, she shrieked. I'm Veronica Blake. I run this community. But the words rang hollow. The officers didn't care. The neighbors didn't care. Even her own son didn't care anymore. She had spent years building an empire of fear and manipulation, but now it was all crumbling to ashes. James turned to Tommy, his voice calm. You did the right thing, kid. Tommy swallowed hard. Tears welled in his eyes, but he nodded. For the first time in his life, he was free. And Veronica? She was dragged away in handcuffs. The flames had died down, but the smoke still hung thick in the air, the scent of burning wood and destruction clinging to the night. James stood with Max by his side, watching as the last of the embers flickered out. The once pristine neighborhood of Willow Crest had never looked more chaotic. The moment Veronica Blake was shoved into the back of a squad car, the atmosphere shifted. The fear she had instilled for years vanished in an instant. Neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors now stood in the open, murmuring among themselves. Some looked relieved, others stunned. And then, one by one, they began stepping forward. She fined me thousands for having a bird feeder, Mrs. Dawson, the elderly woman from 2 houses down, stammered. Said it attracted pests, but she just wanted to push me out. A man clutching his wife's hand spoke next. We got cited for having the wrong kind of flowers in our front yard. She threatened to foreclose on us. Then came a mother, holding her crying child. She banned my son from playing outside because she said kids running around made the community look cheap. The stories kept coming, flooding out like a broken dam, and James realized something. Veronica's downfall wasn't just about him. It was about every single person she had bullied, manipulated, and controlled. A police officer, still taking statements, turned to James. It's looking like she's facing multiple charges. Arson, property damage, abuse of power, and from what we're hearing, there's going to be a full-scale investigation into how she ran this HOA. James nodded, his fists clenching. Good. Then movement from the side caught his eye. Tommy. The boy stood alone, his face pale, arms wrapped around himself like a shield. His eyes were locked on the squad car where his mother sat, screaming at the officers, fighting to hold on to the last shred of power she had left. James approached him slowly. Max, always sensing emotions better than any human, walked beside him, wagging his tail gently. Tommy flinched when James stopped next to him, but he didn't run. "You did the right thing," James said softly. Tommy's lips trembled. She's still my mum," he whispered, voice barely audible. James sighed, looking down at Max. He knew what it was like to lose something, even if that something was toxic. "You don't have to decide how to feel right now," James said, "but you made a choice, a brave one." Tommy sniffled, rubbing his sleeve across his face. "She always said, if I didn't do what she wanted, she'd send me away, that no one would want me." James's chest tightened with anger. "That's not true." Tommy hesitated. Then, for the first time that night, he looked James in the eye. "Then what happens to me now?" James had no answer, but he knew one thing. Veronica had lost everything tonight. But her son? Maybe it wasn't too late for him. The night air was heavy with smoke and tension, but for the first time in years, Willow Crest felt like it could finally breathe. Veronica Blake, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, was gone, hauled away in handcuffs, screaming about property values and her community. But James knew this was far from over. As the police continued taking statements, neighbors whispered among themselves, grappling with the weight of what had just happened. For so long, they had been trapped under Veronica's reign of fear, too scared to speak out, too beaten down by her endless HOA violations and threats of foreclosure. Now they were free, or so they thought. James stood near the remains of his property, Max pressed against his leg, his ears twitching at every sound. The golden retriever had been through enough, and James wasn't about to let his guard down. Then he saw it, a shadow moving at the far end of the street. James tensed. It wasn't the police. It wasn't a reporter. It wasn't even a nosy neighbor trying to get a closer look. It was Michael Blake, Veronica's husband, or rather, the man who had let her burn everything to the ground while standing quietly in the background. Michael had always been a ghost, never present, never interfering. The kind of man who let his wife handle the dirty work while he played the role of the respectable businessman. But now, as he stepped into the dim glow of a streetlight, his mask was cracking. James squared his shoulders, stepping forward. "You looking for something, Michael?" The man stopped, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. For the first time, James noticed the sweat on his brow, the nervous twitch of his fingers. "You don't know what you've done," Michael muttered, his voice low. James let out a cold laugh. "Pretty sure I do." Michael's eyes darted to the police cars lining the street, to the neighbors still speaking with officers. His entire world, the perfect little empire Veronica had built for him, was crumbling. "She went too far," he said, barely above a whisper. "But you just made things worse." James' expression darkened. "Worse for who, Michael? You? Because your wife's corruption is finally being exposed? Because the people she ruined are finally getting justice?" Michael didn't respond. But the way his jaw clenched, the way his fists tightened at his sides, James knew exactly what kind of man he was dealing with. A coward. A man who had no problem reaping the benefits of power until it turned against him. And James? He wasn't about to let him slink away without consequences. "You were part of this," James said, stepping closer, his voice like steel. "You might not have been the one spray-painting threats on my property or planning fake violations on my neighbors, but you knew. You let it happen." Michael's eyes flashed with something dangerous. "You think you're the hero here?" he hissed. "This isn't over, Sullivan." James didn't flinch. "Yeah? Well, the cops over there might disagree." He nodded toward the group of officers, two of whom were now approaching, their focus locked on Michael. "Mr. Blake," one of them called out, "we have some questions for you regarding HOA fund mismanagement." Michael's face drained of color. James smirked. "Oh, right. Almost forgot. Seems someone's been funneling HOA fees into a private account. Guess it wasn't just Veronica pulling the strings after all." Michael took a step back, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Then he ran. The officers were on him in seconds, pinning him against the side of a police cruiser as neighbors watched, their eyes wide with disbelief. James crossed his arms, watching as Michael struggled, as he cursed and shouted about a setup. But it wasn't a setup. It was justice. And for the first time in years, Willow Crest was finally getting it. As the sun rose over Willow Crest, the once pristine streets were now littered with traces of a battle fought in silence for too long. The police had taken Michael Blake away in cuffs, just as they had Veronica the night before. The HOA's reign of terror. The golden retriever's eyes followed the movement of the news van still stationed at the community entrance. James capturing every moment of a scandal that had rocked the entire country, still healing from the bullet wound that nearly took his life. But why didn't it feel like a victory? He glanced down at Max, who gave a slow wag of his tail, his silent way of saying, "We made it." The lawsuits had already begun. Homeowners who had been victims of Veronica and Michael's corruption were coming forward, their voices finally being heard. The city council had announced an official investigation into HOA abuse, and James had received a call from a U.S. senator, offering his full support on legislation that would finally hold HOA boards accountable nationwide. But despite the chaos, James knew this wasn't over. Veronica would fight. Michael would scheme. And the system that had allowed them to thrive was still in place. The war was bigger than Willow Crest. James sighed, running a hand over his face. He had spent his entire career fighting injustice on a national level. He never thought his biggest battle would be fought in his own backyard. Then, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Sullivan," a voice greeted him. "We need you in Washington." James's grip on the phone tightened. He turned, glancing at Max, at his home, at the place he had fought so hard to protect. Maybe his war wasn't over, but this time, he wouldn't just fight for himself. This time, he would fight for every homeowner who had ever been silenced. Would you support James in taking this fight to the next level? If so, comment "Justice for Max" below and let us know your thoughts. Should James take his battle to Congress, or should he stay and rebuild Willow Crest? Tell us in the comments. If this story teaches us anything, it's that power in the wrong hands is dangerous. Veronica and Michael were just one example of how unchecked authority can destroy lives. But the truth is, stories like this are happening right now, across the country. Homeowners are bullied by HOAs, veterans are disrespected, and people in power manipulate the system for their own gain. But 2025 is different. Technology and social media have given power back to the people. Viral videos exposed the truth. Public outrage forced action. And because of that, change is happening. Laws are shifting, homeowners are fighting back. The question is, will we let stories like this continue, or will we demand real reform? James fought back, and won. But the battle isn't over. Veronica and Michael might be gone, but corruption like theirs doesn't die easily. So, what should James do next? Should he, 1, take his fight to Washington and push for nationwide HOA reform? 2, stay in Willow Crest and help rebuild from within? 3, expose more corrupt HOAs across the country? Drop your vote in the comments. Let's decide James's next move together. And don't forget, if you believe in justice for Max, hit that like button and share this story with someone who needs to hear it.